Continuing this morning with our series on pet sins, little sins that can cause big problems. We know intellectually, as we've mentioned before, that there's no difference between big sins and little sins, that sometimes we think about that because we're talking about, the sins that I do, those are little, and the sins that other people commit, those may be big. But we understand intellectually. But so often we act like some sins don't matter. In fact, sometimes our response to some of the things that we've talked about in this series is to smooth them over by saying, hey, that's just the way that I am. And today's sin is probably one of the most likely that we're going to say, well, that's just how I am. Let's introduce it by what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. He says, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Familiar text to most of us. Jesus in this section of the sermon is dealing with, don't be satisfied that you don't just commit outward acts. It's not enough just not to commit adultery. You've got to keep lust out of your heart because it's lust that leads to the sin of adultery. Here he says, it's not enough just not to kill someone. I know there's been at least one time in your life that you thought that you deserved extra credit because you didn't kill someone, right? You were so angry at them. Jesus says to be angry in your heart, to hold on to that anger in your heart, that's like you've killed him. And if you say raka, which is an Aramaic expression of contempt that translates loosely to stupid or fool, then you're in danger of the Supreme Court. The word there for court is actually the word for Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. And anyone that says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. When I grew up, I thought, well, what Jesus means there is, as long as you don't say, you can say stupid and you can say idiot, but as long as you don't call him a fool, you're all right. And of course, that's not what Jesus is saying. Tasker, in his commentary, suggests that the Greek word for fool sounds very much like a curse in Aramaic, that where Jesus would basically be saying, if you tell someone to go to hell, then you're in danger of going there as well. That we are held accountable. We can't say that anger is just the way that I am. We can't say, well, at least I didn't do anything really bad because I was angry. Jesus says he holds us accountable to what goes on in our hearts. And so we deal with anger, and that's what's so hard is we feel, just admit it. When somebody really makes you angry, just listen to that phraseology. Someone makes you angry. You see how we divert the responsibility to whatever it is that's causing the anger. When we get angry, we think that we're entitled to that anger. They said that to me. They did that to me. And then we go and talk to our friends, and they reinforce that, yeah, you should be angry. I can't believe. Jesus says, if we're angry with a brother or sister, and if we carry that into words or actions to that brother or sister, we're flirting with the same sin as if we have murdered them, at least metaphorically, at least spiritually. So we are called into account with how we deal with our anger. At one level or another, I might have mentioned last week that I've known two men in my life where their family said that they never lost their temper. My kids won't be saying that at my funeral. Most of us at some point or another, to some degree or another, have to deal with anger. And for some of us, it becomes almost our besetting sin, quick to fly off the handle. So some things that Paul says in Ephesians 4 is going to fit right in with what we're talking about in dealing with anger. In Ephesians 4, Paul has moved on from his discussion of our calling as Christians and has begun to talk about some very practical applications of what it means to live the Christian life. And he has a section, actually two little sections in Ephesians 4, where he talks about anger. And these are rather familiar verses. Here is what he says in verse 26. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. When he says, in your anger, do not sin, be ye angry and sin not, in the King James, he's actually quoting from Psalm 4. That's actually what the Old Testament says. So he's reminding his audience that God has required this of us from all time, that we are held accountable for what we do when we get angry. And then he goes on to say, and don't hang on to that anger. Not only don't lash out in anger, don't sin in anger, but don't hang on to that anger. And he uses the metaphor, don't let the sun go down while you're still angry. And then he reminds us that it is anger that gives the devil a foothold into our lives. If he can make us angry, if he can keep us angry, then we are much more likely to say or do something that is sinful. And that's what Satan wants. And so anger is one of the tools that he uses against us. Understand, people don't make us angry. I remember a story that Carl Brickin told when he was counseling someone, actually a couple, that had some anger. Both of them had anger issues, and that's not uncommon. And he was trying to help them. And in one fit, the story that they told, one fit of rage, they're arguing, in fact, in bed at night. And they're arguing back and forth at each other. And finally, the husband jumped up out of bed and ran over and went to punch the wall, but stumbled and put his arm right through the window, bedroom window. Cut his wrist all up, blood is spurting everywhere. And with the blood spurting, he went over and held it in his wife's face and said, "See what you made me do?" Now, chances are you've never put your fist through a window in rage. But have you ever heard that expression before? See what you made me do? We want to shift the blame from ourselves and our anger management issues to whatever it is that made us angry. Sadly, this happens when husbands do punch their wives rather than the walls. They feel like it's the wife that makes them do that. And if that continues for long enough, the wife begins to feel like she is the cause of her husband's rage. And if she can only behave well enough, then he won't break into that rage again. Kind of blaming the victim or the victim blaming herself. But Jesus assures us, and Paul assures us, that God holds each of us accountable for the anger that we feel in our hearts and also what we do with that anger and how we manage it and how we allow it to dissipate. So Paul then goes on in verse 31 where he says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice." Actually, the way the NIV here kind of breaks it down is a little bit awkward. These are all single words connected by the word kai, by the word and. So get rid of all bitterness and rage and anger and brawling and slander and every kind of malice. What he's doing, he's using words that are related to each other. We might even say synonyms of different things that relate to anger. First of all, he says, get rid of all bitterness. Bitterness is resentment. It is the anger that is allowed to hold in and you stew on. And every time you see the person that you're angry at, it reminds you of how mad you are. When Simon the Sorcerer tried to buy the gift of the Holy Spirit, Peter said that he was in the root of bitterness, that there was something bitter in him. Maybe he was bitter because the apostles were busting up his business. He was a sorcerer, and here the apostles were doing real miracles. But being bitter is when we are in a state of carrying on. Paul says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Well, if you do, not really talking about the next day, but on and on. If you allow that anger to linger, it becomes resentment and bitterness. Kind of the opposite is rage. Rage is, when the veins on your neck pop out and you're screaming stuff. Not only do people around you not really understand what you're saying because you're so angry when you say it, but you don't really understand what you're saying. You're just angry. That's a rage. It's a word that is used in Acts 19 about a riot that took place in Ephesus, where Paul is making inroads into the community, converting people, and the people that made little memorabilia to the goddess Artemis, that was a pagan deity of the city, got angry because they was messing with their business. And so there was this angry mob that comes to the officials in a rage. Rage causes us... Did you know that the word mad originally didn't have anything to do with anger in English? The English word mad used to mean insane. And it wasn't connected to angry until people noticed that when people were really, really angry, they acted insane. So when you get to the point where you're admitting that you're really mad, careful, because your actions may not make any sense whatsoever. And that's what Paul is warning us of here. Anger is just a general word for anger. It's translated in several different ways in the New Testament. What I found out kind of interesting in the NIV, it doesn't really follow through in all the translations, but in the NIV, it's applied about equally. The Greek word is used equally of God and of people. But in the NIV, when it applies to people, it's anger. But when it applies to God, it is wrath. I think that's interesting because when we talk about anger, we would think in terms wrath being a step above, intensification. But in the language the New Testament was written in, anger and wrath are pretty much the same thing. The difference about God's wrath and our wrath is that God is always just and always right, and we hardly ever are. Brawling. Brawling is also used of a riot that broke out. This one in Jerusalem, as Paul has been accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple, which he didn't do. It's just people are wanting an excuse to tear him limb from limb. And so this mob comes brawling, and Paul wants to speak to them, and he begins to speak, and they get so angry a second time that he has to be taken into protective custody by the Romans. Brawling leads us to say and do things that we really don't mean. Or as my wife said one time after I was making up, after an argument that we had, and I said, I really didn't mean what I said. And her response was, yeah, you did, you just don't mean it now. As usual, she's absolutely right. That's what happens when we get in that. It doesn't have to be physical brawling. It can mean what you do when you get on Facebook and Twitter and you get into one of those discussion things. Why are people so ugly on social media? Well, you remove the personal responsibility sort of thing, and people can give vent and then get in. Sometimes that causes you to give even more vent, which causes you to give even more vent. Brawling is what happens when we give in to anger. And then slander. That's an interesting word to connect here, but it is connected. The Greek word here you'll recognize is the word blasphemia, which is the word for blaspheme. Well, when we think about blaspheming, we think about blaspheming God, and I recommend you not do that. But Paul is telling us you shouldn't blaspheme other people because, you see, when you get really mad, what do? You say things about people that may or may not be true, that even if they're true, they're exaggerated. And very often it's not what you say to the person, brawling, but it's what you say about them when your anger leads you to talk to other people. So slander, very connected to the word for gossip, is what we do when we are truly angry and don't manage it well. And then he says every form of malice. It's really more of a generic word for wickedness or evilness, actions that come from our anger. We had a young man that we were working with years ago that basically we worked with him for years and years and years, and finally, because of various things, we basically decided that we couldn't do any more for him. They needed more help than we could give him. And then it started that every time he would walk by the building, he would kick over our sign, or he broke our ring doorbell thing. He was angry at us, and so he was striking out. That's malice. That's an illustration of what malice is. You're so angry at something that you begin to do things that are evil and wicked. Paul says, get rid of all of those things. The way that ancient writers emphasized something that was very important is that they repeated it. You say the same thing and repeat it several times using synonyms or related words, and that's how you emphasized something. I mean, they couldn't capitalize everything because the New Testament was written in all caps. The Koine Greek in those days didn't have little letters, so everything was in capital letters, no spaces or punctuation either. And they couldn't do italics, that hadn't been invented yet. And they couldn't just underline something, because underlining in Greek is a scratch out. It means, it's what we would do to scratch through something, they scratched under it. Disregard that. So the only way they could emphasize something is to emphasize it over and over and over again by repeating it in different words. And that's what Paul is doing here. He is saying, don't be angry, underline, boldface, italics, don't act out of anger. I don't know how he could be more clear. Again, we want to justify our anger either by, I just tell it like it is, the person that speaks without thinking. Or, my dad was like that, and I just kind of fly off the handle. See, what we're trying to justify, and this is what the series is about, is what we're trying to justify there, just being part of our nature, is sin. Paul says, get rid of all of that. Jesus says, if you're angry at your brother or sister, it's like you've killed them in your heart. Okay, so what if anger is your pet sin? What if this is something that recurs and it's the little baby dragon that continues to grow larger and larger? What are some things we can do? Let me just suggest 4 things. There's all kinds of things. And like some of the things that we talk about in this series, sometimes past trauma and things that we've gone through can get to the point where anger becomes pathological. It becomes something more than just a character flaw. It becomes something deeply rooted in our personality, and sometimes we need help in working through those. So this list is just a list of things that I've drawn from Scripture. There's probably many other things depending on the struggle that you might have. First of all, always use time and distance to your advantage. Last week we saw everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Notice the connection between slow to speak and slow to become angry. We also mentioned that the way that we usually work is we not only we not quick to listen and slow to speak, we're quick to speak before we're done listening, right? The other person gets in the middle of something that we want to say, and we respond to it. When we find ourselves getting angry, the likelihood of saying or doing something that we would not say or do if we measured and thought about it goes up greatly. And so what we need to do is to step away for a moment and let the wave of anger pass so that we can deal with something rationally. For two people that are angry at each other to continue to argue about something is never productive. Neither one of them are listening, and both of them are speaking not out of intellect but rather out of anger. So the old thing about counting to 10 or taking a deep breath or saying a silent prayer or just walking away for a break. Sometimes, I remember one time years ago, I was at this person just always kind of, some people just rub you the wrong way. Now, usually I said that, it's our fault, but in this particular case, it was him, obviously. But I excused myself to go to the restroom 3 times during our conversation. I didn't have to go at all. I just needed not to be where he was for a moment. And sometimes that's the best thing for us to do. You want to say or do what the fruit of the Spirit is leading you to do, not what your anger is calling you to do. Sometimes the only way to do that is to use time and distance. Secondly, and this sounds kind of ironic, don't take Paul too literally. When Paul says, don't let the sun go down while you're angry, that's a metaphor. That's a figure of speech. He's not saying literally that you have to resolve every issue before you can sleep. That husband and wife that were in bed arguing, they're screaming back and forth at each other. At some part, way before that, one of them should have said, we're getting angry and we need to stop. Honey, I love you, but we need to go to bed and get a good night's rest and have a good breakfast tomorrow and then continue this discussion when we're not so tired. One of the worst things to be when you find yourself getting angry is tired or hungry. Because if you have problems with anger, you need your very best self to deal with it. And if you're tired, everything is going to get on your nerves just a little bit quicker. If you're uncomfortable because you're hungry or cold or anything else, defer an argument to the next day. Of course, obviously the example I use is dealing with spouses. You don't have to resolve everything the night before you go to bed. What you have to do is stop being angry long enough to go to sleep. And then you can continue the resolution the next day. Sometimes in an effort to take Paul literally, we don't do what he's actually truly telling us to do. Third, always give people the benefit of the doubt. If somebody says something or does something that really hurts your feelings, so say I use an illustration in a sermon that, as I often do, I say something like, boy, we're looking forward to the football game tonight, especially because the Dallas Cowboys isn't in it. Well, I know some of you probably don't like that or enjoy it nearly as much as I do. I can say things, but maybe if you think, Tuck doesn't usually go out of his way to offend me, maybe he didn't mean it in exactly the same way that I heard it. Maybe, one of our former members, Ella Oni, used to say, well, maybe his feet hurt. Maybe he's out of sorts. Maybe he's having a bad day because he's uncomfortable. The golden rule tells us that we're to do to them what you would have them do to you. I would appreciate it if you would give me a break. Or I would appreciate it if I did offend you, if you came to me and explained, so maybe my intent wasn't even close to the way that you took it. Maybe we can just talk about it. That's the whole point of Jesus in Matthew 18, where you go to the person and then you take somebody else and then, that sort of thing. Because sometimes you can clear it up way before you get to the church. So give the other person the benefit of the doubt. Unless it's that guy that I was talking about that just, really gets on your nerves. No, give everyone the benefit of the doubt. And fourth, don't fall for the catharsis myth. That, sometimes you just got to get it out, let it, just let it out, and then you feel better. Well, if you've ever been on the receiving end of one of those, you know very well it doesn't make the receiver feel better. Now, I've had people tell me that, sometimes I just fly off the handle like that and just say all kind of things, but I don't mean anything by it. Well, I would fall back on my wife's wisdom. Yes, you do. You just might not after you're done. And the way that's received is always harmful. The word that's translated in the NIV, rage, that we saw in Ephesians, is used in Galatians 5 in the list of the works of the flesh and is translated fits of rage. It's really the same word. In other words, that rage that we fly into because we're angry is always a sin. It's always a work of the flesh. And we need to realize that. It may be helpful for you to go out into the woods and pick out an oak tree and scream and holler at it. But to do that towards someone else is always going to be a sin. The hardest thing for us to realize, again, going back to the entitlement thing, is that sometimes we just feel entitled to feel the way we are. Understand that anger in itself is not sinful. That anger is very often just a response to a stimuli. And so you feel the emotion well up and it makes you angry. What we do with that, it decides whether or not we're following God or not. We are responsible for what we do with it. I remember a preacher talking about bringing his family to a hockey match. Yeah, somebody gave him ringside tickets, and so he had his young children with him, and they're all watching the hockey match. And there was some guy behind him that was a little too intoxicated and was screaming profanities through the whole thing. And finally he just got so upset, he stood up and turned around, and the guy behind him turned around, 6'8", and weighed about 300 pounds. And he said, my anger immediately sort of subsided. We can control those fits of rage. Now, in that particular story, the good thing is everybody around him stood up too and asked the guy to behave himself. So that story ended well for my preacher friend. But we can, the point of that is we can control the feelings that maybe not the feelings, but what we do with the anger that we express. In fact, for the love of God, we have to. In Paul's statement of love in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, love, does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. It's interesting that those two are connected together. It is not easily angered, the rage and brawling. It keeps no record of wrongs, resentment, bitterness. Love does not allow anger. Let's pray together.